You're on Vision Christian Radio. It's Neil Johnson with you, the Monday edition of 2020. A conversation very shortly. We will open our talkback lines. You might like to contribute to our conversation today, and we'll do that very shortly. 1-800-316-316. And shortly, when we've laid a foundation for our conversation, we'll open those talkback lines, your opportunity to participate. We're going to be talking about Russia. We're going to be talking about the West. Of course, Australia, one of those Western nations. We're going to talk about our freedoms, freedom of speech. You know, the idea that you and I can think, believe, analyse facts, converse with others, communicate our thoughts and feelings through spoken or written word. It's been a founding principle of our modern Western democracies. It's allowed individuals to question established beliefs, narratives and ideas, including government policies. Well, our special guest today recently returned from a trip to Russia, and he's started asking questions about the state of our world, including our personal freedoms in the West. Dr. Michael Sutton is writing a book on Russia. It's called Journey to the Forbidden Land, and he's revising his book, which is called Is Russia Our Enemy? In fact, it's just been released, a study of Christ's defeat of our true enemy, Satan. Dr. Michael Sutton is a political economist, a professor, a pastor. He's now a publisher, and back with us once again today. Michael Sutton, a special welcome back to 2020.
Oh, thank you very much, Neil. It's so wonderful to be with you again. Thank you very much.
And Michael, upon your return from Russia, you've written a thought-provoking article too that was published by the Brownstone Institute called A Letter from a Forbidden Land. You better take us into this. Tell us about your visit. Some of us might even be surprised that you can actually visit Russia in this day and age. What are your thoughts here? Give us your story.
Well, the government doesn't want us to visit Russia. If you go to the DFAT webpage, they'll tell you that you shouldn't go to Russia. But it's a bit of a problem for the many thousands of Russian Australians who live here and their families and friends and people who just want to visit. You can't get travel insurance from Australia, and you can't have currency exchange. But when you get to Russia, you find it's a remarkable place. It's a beautiful country. It's a vast country. I think that's what strikes you. It's a vast nation, and we call it the Trans-Siberian Railway across half of the country. And what's remarkable about Russia is it's a very multi-ethnic and also multi-religious society. There are laws prohibiting the proselytizing of people across those kinds of religious boundaries, which is understandable in a country that has very large Buddhist and Muslim populations and Christian populations. But what struck me when I was in Moscow, standing on the bridge in front of the largest cathedral in Russia that was built after the Cold War ended, that there are churches almost everywhere. And everywhere around Russia, there was a church that was built on an old bus station. And through that church, a number of people came to Christ. And people remember that, that's the church at the bus station. And there are chapels in parks, there's chapels in universities, and university professors can go and pray after their lectures. And so what you see in Russia is they have had, under Lenin, but particularly through Stalin, an appalling persecution of Christians. And Christians were forbidden to practice their faith. Millions were sent to the gulags and so on. So what they did, the Christians who were not killed or put into prison, they internalized their faith, they made it their own, they kept on to their faith, and it became a real personal faith in God and Christ. And when the Soviet Union became the Russian Federation, you see a great flourishing of faith in Russia. And it's a really encouraging thing to see.
So you were only there something like just a month ago, and you saw there is actually quite a significant freedom of religion insofar as Christians flourishing in their churches. Is that the way you're describing Russia today?
Absolutely. There's great freedom. I went to had the great privilege of meeting the abbot of a monastery. He's responsible for this tragic place where they the Bolsheviks got rid of the bodies of the Romanovs, and they tossed them in this pit, and they destroyed them as well, where they massacred the Romanovs, where they put them. And they've built a monastery there. And I had the privilege of meeting the abbot from this monastery, a lovely man, and he had a sense of peace about him and a sense of, I guess, Christ's presence that I haven't encountered in a long time with someone in the church. And I asked him, what are the challenges facing Russia today in terms of Christian witness? And he said something that really resonated with me. He said, we don't have a problem with the government anymore. And I thought, what a remarkable statement. We don't have a problem with the government anymore. And so what I took away from that was that there is, Russia is, you are seeing a return to a kind of a society where people are free to practice their faith and free to worship God, free to follow Christ in their own way, in a society which we say is an oppressive society, but in fact, in Russia, men are men and women are women, and that's just the way it is.
In fact, I'm sure there'll be listeners who are hearing things here in this conversation that raise all sorts of questions about inconsistencies here, because when we think of Russia and the invasion of Ukraine, and very few people think that that's anything other than one state imposing itself on another state across borders, and they ought not do that. But we think of Vladimir Putin, as a brutal dictator because he is doing that in Ukraine. But that creates some sort of inconsistency, doesn't it? Because in most of the brutal dictatorships that we might be able to see from history, there's been dreadful persecution of Christians. And so the inconsistency is that you're saying Christians are flourishing in Russia and the brutal dictator is not on their backs. Any thoughts here?
Well, it's not, for Neil, if you look at our history, even our own English Australian history, it's not uncommon for Christian nations to fight each other. If you look at the English Civil War, you had both sides praying to God before the battle at Naseby, and that's a famous example of that. And then you have, of course, the most famous example is the American Civil War, where both sides of that conflict were both praying to God. We have many testimonies that Robert E. Lee was a follower of Christ and Abraham Lincoln was a follower of Christ. So you have both sides of that conflict, both believing in God. And Jesus did say that when he returns, his second coming will be prefaced by wars and rumours of wars. And so wars will always be with us. And also, Neil, we have to remember that in our own backyard, Australia has participated in the Afghan-Iraq conflicts, which we went to war and sent those poor nations back to the Stone Age for 20 years. So these were democratic nations like Australia and America going in, looking for weapons of mass destruction that weren't there and looking for a guy we knew was living in Pakistan. So it's sort of like wars are not just fought by authoritarian states. Unfortunately, war is a consequence. And as James says in his letter, why do you fight? It's because you want it, so you take it. And we do it because it's the nature of sin, and sin will always be with us. And the answer to sin, of course, is the death and resurrection of Christ, who brings the only hope and freedom that we can have as humans.
Michael, what were you picking up from Christian believers that you were talking to in Russia? And as you say, there's something that they're enjoying in freedom, freedom of religion, and the church is flourishing. Do Christians typically support what has been happening under Putin and in the invasion of Ukraine?
Two traditions of Christianity that I saw in Russia. One is that what some very eager Christians have done is put crosses at the entrance to lots of cities, these giant crosses, and so not all Russians are that happy about this. And so there's a tradition, there's a sort of a religious tradition, would say like a revival of orthodoxy, and so there's lots of chapels and there's lots of crosses, and a lot of people wear crosses, and a lot of people pray, and they go to all those things. And there are a lot of people who remember, whose families remember the past, and so in those families they have revived a lot of those Orthodox traditions. Then the other Christians, there's also the Old Believers too in Russia, which I didn't know anything about. This is a very fascinating group of Russians, where they were they were entire cities and communities called Old Believers, and they refused to accept the amendments or changes to the Orthodox Church. And they're a little bit like the Amish, I suppose, in America, but they're very devout people, very sincere followers of Christ, and they have built these communities and these towns where they practice their faith. And then there's another strand of Christianity in Russia, which is an internal faith, a personal faith, where they don't follow a particular creed or church building or church organization, but they follow Christ, they follow God in their own way. Something like the non-church movement in Japan. So there's very much a thread, several threads of Christianity in Russia when you think of it. But Russians are they're very open about talking about their lives, and everyone's aware of the conflict in the Ukraine. They're aware of the origins of the conflict dating back to 2014, when America helped to topple the democratically elected government in Ukraine and put in their puppets. And you see it on Zelensky's face. He's like a kite in a whirlwind. He doesn't know whether he's coming or going. And you see little glimpses of Zelensky at the United Nations where he actually says his opinion publicly, and everyone condemns him. And my great fear with this whole situation is that America will betray the Ukraine like they betrayed the Kurds, and then we'll just move on to the next conflict, which may be in Africa, maybe climate change. Ultimately, what needs to happen is there needs to be peace settlement, negotiation. Sadly, the churches are aiming for total defeat of Russia, which will not happen. Russia will prevail in this conflict. They just simply have more factories. It's like the Civil War in America. The North won because they had the military might, and Russia will win because they have the factories and the weapons. Doesn't matter how many Abrams tanks America sends them.
On this issue, so far as the Western nations, and Australia is a Western nation, we've seen lots of our own freedoms coming under threat. Your reflections here from your visit to Russia, and thoughts about some rising threats here.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Neil. I think what really struck me in the West, I had this privilege of meeting this family who were living in Russia, and she told me, the wife told me the story of her grandmother, and she lived in, I think it was Belarus before the war, and Belarus was part of the old Soviet Union, and anyway, there was this guy in their town who didn't like them, and didn't like them because they had a cow. And so he went to the KGB and reported on them, or the KGB in those days, and reported on them that they were enemies of the state. And so they were then persecuted. They had children, and they had to forcibly move from one side of Russia to the other. And this lady had great faith in Jesus, and they went and they lost their kids. All their kids perished. And then they re-established in the middle of Russia in the Ural Mountains, and they built a life for themselves. They were very successful. God blessed them in their lives, and all their children were successful. And then at the end of their life, they went back to that old town, and there was almost no one left in that town, except the man who was their Judas, who had betrayed them. And they went to him and said to him, "Was it worth it?" And he just looked at them in horror that they were still alive. And for me, it was a real great story of faith that the grandmother used to say, "The Lord God will lead me, the Lord God will lead me." So despite all the persecution under Stalin, she still had her faith within her. And yet the terrible things happen because this man didn't like them. He makes up an accusation and they get persecuted. And that's where we are today in the West. We have what misery that the Russians experienced under Stalin. It is what we're entering into at the moment. You have these soldiers who are going off to fight for freedom in the Ukraine against Russia. And when they come back, they might be prosecuted, cancelled, or sued if they say something as radical as only women can get pregnant, or Christ is Lord, or things that we used to say every day, but now we're not allowed to say. And so what we're seeing in Russia and in China is we're seeing that they went through hell. The Maoist period was a nightmare. The Stalinist period was a nightmare. But God in his wisdom has resurrected his people in those places. And so whatever future they have, they are not going to have the nightmare that God is in store for us. Because the future of Australia, as a lot of your listeners will know, is that free speech is under attack. Democracy is under attack like never before. unlike anything we've ever seen, particularly in COVID hysteria, where they shut down everything, closed down the churches. Now we're being told with the this so-called referendum, you must vote yes. You don't see many no votes, no placards around, because people will get persecuted if they express their opinion. So I mean, where's the better place to live in a country like Russia or in Australia, where persecution looks like it's just around the corner?
Well, there are controversial elements to a conversation like this, and it may be raising some issues for you. Well, our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. Let's take a call. Alex is in Melbourne. Hi, Alex. Welcome along.
Oh, hello, Neil. Welcome back. Yes, I'm a bit confused with... I'm pretty sure I heard on the Vision News maybe a week or two ago, there was a pastor a Baptist pastor from Russia had to leave Russia. I think his name was Yuri Sipko. I think it was mentioned on the news. And I thought, well, because he was, I'm not too sure whether he was praying for both Russia and Ukraine or what the situation was, but something like that was said, and I just got the gist of it, and I'm thinking, but this doesn't make sense now.
This doesn't make sense, and I'll get Michael in on this, because when you hear these sorts of stories and there are pastors who are outspoken, I guess it's one thing to be allowed to flourish in freedom, but if you do say the wrong thing that rubs up against the regime, then you are going to be in trouble, aren't you? So a thought or two here from Michael.
Well, if you read my book, very controversial book, Is God on America's Side, I take to issue the whole idea of free speech, because from a Christian viewpoint, there really is no such thing as free speech, because, James says that our tongue is like a raging fire, and what we say can build or destroy, discourage or discourage, encourage or discourage. And so we're encouraged to be very careful how we speak. And there are lots of laws around what we can and can't say anyway, even in our free society. You can't slander anyone, you can't make up stories about people. And it astounds me, have the very rich people like Hillary Clinton and people like that, horrible things have been said about them by so many people, and they just choose not to sue people but it's entirely their right to do so. There are restrictions in Australia on what we can and can't say, and they're there for very good reason. Every country is different. Every country has different rules about what you can and can't say. I mean, I reflect on St. Paul, where he talks about Christ is Lord, and yet he was whenever he said Christ is Lord, that was an affront to the Roman Empire. But at the same time, he used his his Roman citizenship to advance the gospel. And so it's a complex kind of world we live in. I think we have to find the light in the dark places, and we have to manoeuvre as God sees us.
Alex in Melbourne, anything more to add, Alex?
Well, I'm pretty sure the Russian Orthodox would do their best to be on the side of Mr. Putin there, but anyway, I don't know. I just like to read the Word of God, because that's the real light in there, and real freedom is in the Lord Jesus Christ in our life. If we can fight the good fight, God help us.
Alex, thanks so much for your contribution. Our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. Interesting to raise this, because in my understanding, and you might have some other insight here, Michael, while in the West we still have in many instances separation of church and state. In other words, the state does not have control over the church. From what I understand, in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church is under the thumb of the Communist Party under Putin, and they do have some right of veto over who is appointed as a bishop or an archbishop. Any thoughts? I mean, you've got about a minute to news. Time's running short, but any thoughts?
I agree with Alex. The freedom comes through Christ, and Alex is absolutely right. Our freedom is in Jesus Christ. There's no communist party in Russia, as I understand it. Putin's not a communist. But the West doesn't have separation of church and state. We've never had that. We have churches that survive through tax exemptions. They survive through whatever the state decides for them, and there's strong relationships between the church's education system and government policy. So there's not really a strict. We're not the United States. We don't have that strict separation of church and state in Australia. But I think what's interesting is that we are called to follow God in whichever calling He's called us to. And there's one thing I say with all my books is God doesn't promise what He doesn't promise, and He doesn't promise us freedom from persecution. That's, in fact, if you are being persecuted, you're on the right path.
So let's hear from Katie, who is in Nil in Victoria. Hi, Katie. Welcome along.
Hi, gentlemen. How are you?
Very well, Katie. What are your thoughts?
Sorry. I actually came in partway through the conversation. I heard something about it earlier, and I was trying to avoid it because, to be honest, I get anxiety and just stressed out even thinking about the way the Western countries are going, including Australia. So I try and think about it as little as I can, to be honest, because it upsets me. I just want to speak about something, talking about privacy issues, because we know that a lot of information's collected, online on Facebook and Google and all that sort of stuff. But even on our phones, I know some people that weren't vaccinated, and they suddenly, in some time in the middle of COVID, started getting this encrypted messaging system on their phones. And it's only specific people I know that weren't vaccinated. I mean, other people may have it, but I noticed last night on 60 Minutes that, and this politician may have done something illegal, and that's okay, that's another issue. But what I'm saying is 60 Minutes said that they had collected hundreds of hours or something, or they'd watched over numerous years of this person's messaging from encrypted messages. And I even feel like, I know this might sound a bit paranoid, but I honestly think that the government is collecting, or someone somewhere is collecting this information, and, it could come back to bite us in 3 years or,
Katie,
5 years or...
You're raising some important issues, and there's certainly a way that this is a part of our conversation in some sense. Let's come to our guest today, Dr. Michael Sutton, because all this information gathering, our privacy issues, our freedom issues, surveillance issues, and this is what I think Katie is referring to. No one is safe. No one has levels of privacy and freedom. And there's always that risk that those things that are said in past and they're on the record digitally by way of our data, our metadata, those can be used against us. And this would be something that we'd often refer to as happening in nations like Russia or in China, where surveillance is so significant that this is the way that the government controls the people. Any thoughts here for Katie?
Well, the difference between, it's a really good question, Katie. It's a bit from left field, but it's very important. What you have in societies need something to hold them together. So in an authoritarian society, that you need force. Usually force or the rule of law is very important, and so if people fall out of line, they go to prison. So it's force that holds them together in authoritarian states. But in societies like Australia, which is at least claims to be a democracy, what holds society together is propaganda, and propaganda is essentially persuasion. We're encouraged to behave in certain ways, and indicative of, I guess, decline in the government's belief that people are good. We see the rise in the surveillance state in the West, and so we see a greater paranoia. The paranoia isn't us. The paranoia is in the government, and we see it in their dumbing down of the population through social media. They want to make us as stupid as possible, as dumb as possible, because the greatest human resource is you, Katie, and it's everyone else who listens, because God's given us a brain, which is the most amazing thing ever created by God. And governments in the West, they don't want us to use our brain. They want us to just do as we're told. And so it's probably a reflection, I think, of the government, certainly since 9/11, the government in the West, they're declining faith in their own people to trust them to believe in a certain way, behave in a certain way. And this happened a century ago as well, this crisis of confidence within the government. If you go back to the beginning decades of the 20th century, the great fear was what happened in Russia with the Russian Revolution, terrible fear over that might happen in America or Australia. And so as a result of that was the welfare state to, I guess, placate the poor and prevent them from rising up against the government. And so we've had the welfare state for 100 years now, and so we're coming towards the end of this period, and so there's this rising paranoia of the government. So I think you've really hit the nail on the head there, Katie. And how we go from there, well, that's another question entirely.
Katie, anything further to add?
No, I just think it's really sad. It breaks my heart. It's good. It's great that you're all talking about it, and we do have to keep, seeking to try and do God's will every day and serve the Lord, even if things become really difficult. I mean, even if we go to jail for our faith, because I think that's where a lot of this is heading, and we just hopefully, we know that the Lord's coming soon, and we need to try and keep our eyes fixed on Jesus.
Well done, Katie.
And I think that's all we can really do.
Thanks.
I mean, there's other things we can do, but that's mainly what we can do as individual believers.
Katie, thank you so much for your call. Our talkback line is open on 1-800-316-316. Let's just stay with this for a moment, and just to put you into a little corner here, Michael, put you on the spot. As Christians, we appreciate the gospel message. There is a proclamation of that message. Some people would say that over many centuries of the church has been a little bit coercive and even propaganda-oriented as well. The difference between this proclamation and propaganda, I mean, as Christians, we have this proclamation of the gospel. There is a narrative around God's revealed way of seeing things, believing things, but you've got this propaganda that's coming from some of these coercive authoritarian states, and growing here in Australia too. Any thoughts here around the thoughts of propaganda and coercion, and who we put our trust and faith in?
I think that's a really good question, Neil. I think that what you have increasingly since 9/11 probably is an increasing, I guess we've adopted a lot of American thinking about politics and about the world, and we've kind of been sucked in like a vacuum cleaner, sucked us into the American culture war. And so you have a lot of Christians talking about the left-wing view or the communist view, and like communist China. There's no communist China is long gone. It's a socialist market economy. Or there's the right view, or Christians must be left view. They can't have a left-wing view. They must be right-wing. I always like to say that there's the view on the right, there's the view on the left, and then there's the truth. And the truth always comes from the scriptures. That's God's word to us. And I think I'd encourage your readers to open the Bible and read the Bible and let God speak through his word, what he wants to say to them at that particular day. And God says that he will give to people wisdom if they ask for it, if they want it. And the answers to all our problems are met in the scriptures that God has promised to us. But there are a lot of things he doesn't promise to us. He doesn't promise, nice sports cars and nice houses. But he does give us his son. And in the son there is freedom, there's life, and there's reconciliation to God. So everything we need in life is found in the son, and we must follow him wherever that leads.
Of course, it's an interesting conversation, isn't it, to talk about how you establish and understand the truth. It's all very well to say, open the Bible and truth will be there, but there's a certain discernment of how that truth applies to all of the circumstances that we might be trying to assess, the issues that a nation focuses, the issues that a family or a community focuses on, discerning the truth. And I guess some of those things you boil down to some rules of thumb about what a Christian believes. And as you say, not necessarily right or left, but how do we discern truth out of what God says? Now, let me just put you on the spot again here, Michael, because there's other big issues that we're talking about now. And the last caller who called through, Katie, I mean, she was saying, things like, dumbing down and the surveillance idea of trying to control people. Is there something here that we can talk around, perhaps even, what is one of the most relevant issues to Australians right now, the voice? We're going to be asked to vote yes or no on the 14th of October. Some will say there's been a huge dumbing down of trying to understand what that might mean. Give us your insights here into how you make that sort of discernment, perhaps even using the voice as an example.
Okay, well, your listeners might be interested in my the subject for today's podcast in my series, which is What is God's Opinion on the Voice to Parliament, which was available today with Spotify, with freedomatterstoday.com. But I was reading Katie mentioned looking unto Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. I think she was quoting from Hebrews there. And I'm starting a new series where I'm going through Hebrews and looking at who is Jesus, the nature of Jesus. And I keep coming back when I'm thinking about the voice to that first chapter 1, verse 1, where it says, long ago God spoke many times in many ways to our ancestors through the prophets, and now in these final days he has spoken to us through his Son. So for me, the voice, the only voice that matters, is the voice of God through the Son. And so we need to dwell on the identity, the words, the actions of Christ. And when we've run out of time looking at that, we should look at it again. For me, God gives us a brain and he's given us reason, and we ultimately, for decisions of politics, we must make up our own mind on these things. I remember there was a famous Australian politician who was asked his opinion on some topic, and he said this was his decision, and he was asked, well, what's the Christian view? He said, well, look, I'm a Christian, I follow Jesus, but I'm approaching this issue from my understanding of politics. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with a man or a woman wanting to be a soldier, for example. God honours the profession. He honours the men in Russia who are fighting for Russia, the ones who are fighting for Ukraine. He honours men and women who decide to serve their country. But he doesn't tell us which side he's on in a war. Nowhere in scriptures does he say he's on the side of the left or the right or the up or the down. Those things are hidden from us. And it's a good thing, because if we knew that God was on the side of a particular side in battle, then we would know that the deaths of those men and women was intentional. And that's not how God works. God gives us freedom. He honours the day, and his mysteries are in those sort of everyday providential things are hidden from our sight. But he's given us wisdom to make a decision whether we should vote yes or no. But we should not listen to those who say only Christians should vote yes or only Christians should vote no, because those people don't know who God is. I'm really sorry, those guys who are saying yes or no from this is what God says. Well, God's view is that I want you to listen to my Son. That's God's view. And as for the other things in life, he's given us reason, he's given us intelligence to make up our own mind. And anyone who tells you otherwise, he's just given them a copy of the Gospels.
Okay, well, 1-800-316-316, and we're talking Russia. We've also introduced now some conversation around what happens when there is propaganda, when there is a dumbing down, where there is power and control issues. So 1-800-316-316. Let's take another call. Glenn is in Serena in Queensland. Hi, Glenn. Welcome along.
Hi, Neil. How you going? Thanks,
Good.
guys, for all your work.
Thank you. And what are your thoughts today?
Just like to contribute perhaps a little insight. I'm an ex-soldier. I served in the Australian Army for 20 years, regular Army. Perhaps the way our brothers and sisters could view our current world, if they look back at history, is you could consider there's been a number of world empires. And it's important to remember that during World War II, Russia was actually our ally against the Nazis in that particular conflict. And in my opinion, with the Five Eyed Nations and from what I've seen, it might be a different way to look at the current political landscape, to view the West as the current world empire. And perhaps Australia could be considered the southern province of that empire. And any empire likes to flex its muscle. It doesn't like to be defeated. It likes to push its agenda. So I just like to put that thought forward, and perhaps our listeners could say, hey, I never thought of it like that. We live in a democratic country, or so we're told. But what's interesting is that no matter how people vote, the direction continues to go along the same line. and we seem to change the jockey but not get rid of the horse.
I think there's real wisdom in the things you're sharing here, Glenn, because it all seems to be that everyone's on one side here, and so when we're talking left and right and where the Christian discerns truth in all of that, that gets to be challenging too. Let's get a thought or two from Michael. Michael, for Glenn?
Oh, well, thank you, Glenn, for your service for our country. It's I always I think it's an amazing thing for those who decide to join the armed forces and serve their country. It's a great thing, regardless of which flag they fight under. There's a real camaraderie there. And I think what you say, you're absolutely right. I mean, Australia is part of the American Empire, and we were part of the British Empire for a long time. As I say controversially in my article, Australia is a mercenary state. We seem to fight many wars that other people want us to fight. In this particular conflict, Australia, one of the reasons Australia is in this conflict is for the promised bounty that we'll get once the conflict is over in terms of military contracts and reconstruction contracts. Though I probably suspect America will just stab us in the back like they did in Iraq and give all the contracts to American corporations. But and we gave away a lot of Bushmasters for free to the Ukraine, which was bizarre. Without any strings attached. But what's interesting is, as you say, it is an empire, and unfortunately, we are in a place where we have so many Christians in Australia. And Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they should be called children of God." And so many Christians just follow whichever war the government wants, and as a result of this, Christian faith declines. It's interesting, in the Soviet Union. I saw footage of what they did. There's an incredible museum in Yekaterinburg, beautiful museum about Russia. And it's a video museum, and they have all this footage of what the Russians did to the churches. Unbelievable. They just blew them up. Exploding the churches, church after church, and putting all these thousands of ministers in prison. But through that experience, they held on to their faith. And as a result of that, today Russia is a country where people, they are increasingly free to practice their faith. And for me, I do despair of what's happening in Australia, because Christians ought to stand up for what the gospel is about, which is peace from God, but also peace between ourselves. And we don't have any human enemy. As Paul says, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. But even though we do wrestle against Satan, Satan was defeated by Christ in the wilderness and at the cross. And his goal today is to destroy the testimony of Christ amongst the faithful. And we have to keep going back to what Jesus has done for us.
Glenn, thank you so much for your call, and time's running short. Let's squeeze in one more call. Julie is in Robina on the Gold Coast in Queensland. Hi, Julie. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. I haven't heard, I've been on hold so I couldn't hear the radio, but just while where the direction had headed, but you had been talking about the no vote, but mainly the war with Russia and Ukraine and all that sort of thing.
Yep.
I suppose, like, I'm now in my 60s, and I've been horrified with the way Australia is heading of late, with freedom of speech and propaganda being spread, and if it's something different than the government believes, then it's misinformation and all that sort of thing. So to me, that's been alarming, that that has been able to happen in our country, and laws coming in against freedom of speech and all that sort of thing. But I suppose my question, in the war with Russia and Ukraine, and, you'd made, the comment was made that, we don't really know, on which side God is, and that sort of thing. But I suppose, and I only know what's being said to us too, through media and stuff, but, and hearing people interviewed from Ukraine where women and children are raped, and, so many violations of human rights. And I suppose, I have to ask myself, if a leader of a country is allowing that sort of thing that seems to be quite widespread in that war, how could we justly say, it's good that Christians are having more of a free rein there.
Julie, I think you're making some good points here.
Yes.
Just to pick up on this thought and get Michael's insight here, because in the context of our conversation, wherever there are those dreadful violations of human rights, Christians ought to be perhaps speaking up for those who can't speak for themselves. Any thoughts here for the things Julie is saying, Michael, and this thought that, whose side are you on? Well, we're on God's side, but thoughts here for the sorts of things Julie is sharing.
Yeah, absolutely, Julie. Well, it's not a one-way conflict. I mean, there are human rights abuses against the peoples of Luhansk and Donetsk as well. I mean, I met a family here in Australia who had a beautiful home in Ukraine and going well, and the Ukrainians blew their house to bits, destroyed their home, and now they're living in Australia as refugees. And so they've been here for quite a while. This was well before the conflict escalated in 2022. So the war's been going on for almost 10 years now. And when I was in Russia, I saw some exhibitions of the children of one of these towns where they were stuck under. Their parents basically put them underneath the house for 8 years because their town was being bombed by Ukraine for 8 years. But we don't hear about any of that. We just hear about whatever the American media wants us to hear about, and the Western media about the one-sided conflict. I mean, both sides have been accused of war crimes. And war is a horrible thing. And maybe I think the answer would have been, if America hadn't stopped rearming or arming Ukraine after February 2022, would have a peace settlement. And maybe the Americans and the Western powers who didn't renege on the Minsk agreement in 2014, which they signed in 2015, in 2022 in February, then we wouldn't be in this conflict as well. As we know from the Germans admitted that the Minsk agreement was a farce, and they intended to arm Ukraine in the intervening years. And so America actually had military personnel on the ground in Ukraine before the conflict began. So what were they doing there? And we mustn't also forget the 130 biolabs that the Americans have in the Ukraine as well. So we've got to ask the question, what are they doing there as well? So geopolitics is a messy business. What I would go back to with what Glenn was saying, and that is, God honours the soldiers, and he doesn't, he honours the soldiers of both sides, and he knows where they fall, and he knows their lives and their last moments, and he holds them in his heart, even when we forget them. And for me, as someone who's been involved with RSL and that, the most important lesson of war isn't the war, but it's what happens afterwards. And we can never forget the soldiers who fight. We can never forget them, and we should always support them. Doesn't matter what side they're on, because they are often the ones we neglect.
And there are tens of thousands of soldiers who have lost their lives in this dreadful conflict. Thank you so much, Julie, for your insight. Time has run out. For listeners who want to connect with our guest today, Dr. Michael Sutton, political economist, a professor, pastor, publisher, his website is freedommatterstoday.com. You'll be able to have a listen in for his thoughts around The Voice on his podcast today. You're also able to connect with Michael through not only his website, but he has just published a letter from the Forbidden Land with the Brownstone Institute. Brownstone.org is the website there. He's written a number of books. We talked about Is Russia Our Enemy? That's one just recently revised and re-released. Michael's also writing a book called Journey to the Forbidden Land. Last time we were talking about a book that he'd written called Freedom from Fascism, a Christian Response to Mass Formation Psychosis. So if you want to get into some deep stuff, you could look into those. But freedommatterstoday.com. Dr. Michael Sutton, thank you so much for taking some time to share your thoughts and your insights with listeners today on 2020.
Thank you very much, Neil. It's been a wonderful privilege to be on. Thank you very much. God bless you.